This is an update to the video I made looking at Matt Parker's response to a video by Dr Shiva Ayyadurai. I got some interesting comments on that video that led me to some more investigations, so I thought I'd make an update. If you're not familiar with the subject, you could check out my previous video first. What I plan to do in this video is further test Matt's logic in a different way by running an experiment. And then I'm going to try to understand why obviously smart, intelligent people on both sides don't agree when they're presented with the same data. And then finally, I'll present some interesting maths behind the Dr Shiva plot. First of all, the experiment. I'm going to run an election. I will fraudulently change the data. I will let Dr Shiva come up with a theory about election fraud. And then I'll invite Matt to use his method to disprove Dr Shiva's theory. Here are my election rules and voting model. The election will have Republican and Democrat candidates only. There'll be straight party and split ticket voting. I'll use a fairly simple set of probabilities to model how the population will vote, and this is similar to the models described in the videos referenced below. I'll allow some variation of these probabilities for more or less Republican areas. Okay, so I've run my election, and here are the results. In my election, this is how the voting went. 56% of Republicans voted straight party. Republican split-ticket voters all voted for Trump 100%. They only split the ticket because there was a really good Democrat candidate lower down the ticket. About 55% of Democrats voted straight party, but this varied slightly depending on how Democrat the precinct was, from about 51.5% in low Democrat precincts to about 58.5% in high Democrat precincts. The Democrat split-ticket voters voted 95% for Biden, but a few liked Trump, and so the other 5% voted for him. On Dr. Shiva's plot, the true results look like this. I've put some random noise on the data for effect, but the solid line shows the exact voting model calculation. Now my preferred candidate is not winning, so I decide to fraudulently change some votes. I take some of the Republican straight party votes and I change them to split ticket votes so that I can change them to vote for Biden. I vary the amount of straight party votes I do this for to try to cover my tracks. In low Republican areas, I do this for about 40% of the straight party votes, increasing to about 90% in high Republican areas. Now I change 50% of all of the Republican split-ticket votes to vote for Biden instead of Trump. All the other votes I leave the same. Now I replot Dr. Shiva's plot and see what I get. I plot the results against some old 2020 Kent County data to make sure it doesn't look too suspicious. Great, it's similar, so nobody will be able to tell that I cheated. Then some guy called Dr. Shiva plots the data and comes up with a theory that there's been some fraud in the election. He publishes his theory. Matt Parker sees it and decides to investigate. Matt reproduces Dr. Shiva's plot. Now Matt says, I wonder what I'll see if I plot the equivalent Biden plot. After seeing the result, Matt says, this cannot represent a net movement of votes. I cannot overemphasize how you cannot have this both ways. It's meant to show a net change. They claim that there was a change of votes taken from Trump and given to Biden. But in that case, you'd expect Biden's plot to show the matching unnatural anomaly uptick. It doesn't, it slopes down. Matt concludes that he has debunked Dr. Shiva's theory by showing that it is internally inconsistent and cannot indicate a net switching of votes. But hold on, there was a net switching of votes. I know there was because I did it. I also know that exactly the same vote shift is shown in both of those plots. Because I have the original results, I know that the real results had a nearly horizontal line, and the difference between that and the results with the downslope on the Trump plot does represent the votes I shifted, just as Dr. Shiva's theory has stated. Matt seems to have proved something false that is actually true. So what is actually happening? The key is in how Matt has interpreted Dr. Shiva's theory and how he has presented it on the Biden plot. He says the main target of the theory is the slope going down, and he introduces a horizontal line on the Biden plot at plus 20%. This is somewhat arbitrary, as there's no evidence of horizontal data at 20%. He then says the Trump and Biden plots are the same. He does mention that Biden's plot is higher, but dismisses that as not relevant and says the indicator of fraud is the downward slope. Is this a reasonable interpretation? I think part of the debate about Matt's debunking stems from subtly different definitions of what the theory is that he is examining. Let's look at two possible options. Firstly, if we interpret Dr. Shiva's theory as the expected result is that split-ticket votes are expected to follow the straight party vote ratio, the data should be roughly along the zero line. A difference from that line is an indicator of votes being switched. Below means taken away and above means added. If we use that theory to interpret the data, the Trump plot shows Trump gaining a bit in low Republican areas, but losing significantly in high Republican areas. The Biden plot shows Biden losing a bit in high Democrat areas, but gaining significantly in low Democrat areas. The two plots are consistent and there's no contradiction. If, on the other hand, we interpret Dr. Shiva's theory as we draw a horizontal line through the data where it crosses the left axis, and a downward slope from that is an indicator of votes being taken from your candidate, then when we examine the two plots, the theory appears contradictory because the two plots seem to show both candidates losing votes. So I have a possible explanation for why two groups of smart, intelligent people could come to opposite conclusions when looking at the same plots. It's because they have different understandings of the theory they're trying to analyze. They have different perspectives. The argument now becomes a matter of opinion and not of mathematical logic, so it's more difficult to find the right answer. So which is the best definition of Dr. Shiva's argument? This is just my opinion. It's true that Dr. Shiva confuses the issue by erroneously arguing that an across-the-board shift of votes would simply be a horizontal line above or below the zero line. But it's clear if you watch his video that the central assumption of the theory is that straight party percentage vote is supposed to be the expected result. In Matt's own description of the theory, he recognizes that this is the fundamental assumption, and in his own words, there should be a very small difference in the percentage between them. And he doesn't justify why he draws the horizontal line at plus 20% on the Biden plot. My opinion is that on balance, the first description of Dr. Shiva's theory is more reasonable. You may disagree and say the second interpretation is better and Matt is correct, and he has successfully debunked the theory. If you think that, and you don't mind the maths getting a bit more complicated, I'd like to examine that too, so watch on. So what does Matt's horizontal line at plus 20% actually mean? To investigate further, I want to find the meaning of that line. Now, some people have argued that such a line is meaningless and it's not possible to get a horizontal straight line on that graph except the zero line. Now, I'm not a mathematician, but it only took me about 5 minutes to find a way to get such a horizontal line. Using my voting model as before, I set the following: Republican straight party vote ratio to 0.5, Democrat straight party vote ratio 0.5, fraction of Democrat candidate voters voting for Biden, 100%, fraction of Republican candidate voters voting for Trump, 1 minus 0.2 divided by PR, where PR is the ratio of Republican voters in the precinct. In other words, the fraction of Republican voters voting for Trump varies with how Republican the precinct is, using the equation given. When I set the model like that, this is what I get: a horizontal line at plus 20%. Now, before anyone screams, as a good engineer, I need to attach physical meaning to my maths. And in this application, I can't have a negative vote fraction, so part of my chart is not physically possible. I'll shade this part out and plot the line with this constraint. Okay, I accept that this is now not horizontal at the end, but that's a limitation of the real-world application, not the maths. It's straight except for a real-world limit near the end. Now I'll draw the line that Matt drew on his plot to fit the data. To get this line, I set fraction of Democrat candidate voters voting for Biden to 0.8 and the fraction of Republican candidate voters voting for Trump to 0.6. In Matt's video, he decided to use a straight line and argued it didn't make any difference. I would like to stick with the original and have a horizontal section, which Matt shows at the start of his video. I've made the mathematical definition of that compound line. Now, what does the difference between the lines represent? Matt argued that if Dr. Shiva's theory is consistent, this has to represent a net shift away from Biden. Well, as we now have the mathematical definition of both of those lines, we can calculate what the vote change is between the two. We can calculate and plot the fraction of the vote that Biden gets for each line. In the chart below, the precincts are ordered left to right, least Democrat to most Democrat. Let's assume precincts are uniformly distributed in the mathematical space and equal in size, so we can count actual votes. Then the area under each curve represents the number of votes for Biden. The red line is the difference, showing that votes shifted away from Biden. We can do exactly the same with the Trump plot, and we show that the plot does indeed show that the downsloping line indicates votes shifted away from Trump. According to Matt, this is not possible. The reason is that the two plots do not share the same baseline. Again, it's a matter of perspective. We can see this if we plot both baselines and the actual results on the same chart. The real data is between the two baselines. I mathematically modelled the black line just to illustrate the point. The Biden chart shows votes shifted away from the Biden baseline, and the Trump chart shows votes shifted away from the Trump baseline. The sensible place to put the baseline is along the zero line, and arguably this is more consistent with Dr. Shiva's statements throughout his first video. If you watched my first video, this will start to look familiar. So here's my conclusion. People's opinion depends on their perspective. If we look from a different position, we see a different thing. We need to agree on a common starting point before we start. On balance, I think that Matt has not fairly represented Dr. Shiva's method on his plots. If Matt had used the zero line as a baseline and said the difference from that line shows vote shifting, then it would have been clear that the two plots are consistent. With Matt's interpretation of Dr. Shiva's method, it's not clear where to draw the horizontal baseline, and I think this should have caused some examination of the understanding of the theory. It's possible to show that relative to the baselines that Matt drew, the downsloping lines on both charts do indeed show a shift of votes away from both Biden and Trump. It's a matter of perspective. The actual result is between the two selected baselines. It's clear, if it wasn't already, that except for the zero line, the horizontal line does not mean what Dr. Shiva originally suggested. However, Matt did not say that Dr. Shiva is wrong because his understanding of the horizontal line is incorrect. He said Dr. Shiva is wrong because these two plots cannot represent a net movement of votes. You cannot have this both ways. Well, I think that you can have it both ways if you plot different horizontal baselines on the two plots, which is what was done. Vote shifts have to be defined from an initial state or baseline. I accept that the logic about the second interpretation of the theory is a little more subtle, and I won't be surprised if people still disagree with me. However, I think there's sufficient logic here for those agreeing with Matt to at least concede that there are shades of grey, and Matt may have slightly overstated his case. I'd like to stress again, as I did in the first video, that the fact that I disagree with Matt's method does not mean that I think Dr. Shiva's theory is valid, just that we need a better method to test it. If I've convinced anyone to change their mind, you can go back and change your vote on the previous video, or like this one. If you want to be notified about the next video, subscribe to this channel.